They called him crazy for choosing her, mocked him relentlessly behind his back, and pitied him to his face. But when the mountain man revealed his bride on their wedding night, every whisper of judgment fell silent. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. The morning sun cast its first light over the dirt roads of Pine Valley, deep in the Wyoming territory, where every whisper could become a storm by noon. The small frontier town was just awakening, shopkeepers sweeping wooden porches and ranchers already returning from early chores. In this place, where entertainment was scarce and winters long, gossip was currency more valuable than gold. By 8 o'clock, the saloon was already crowded, despite the early hour. Men leaned against the worn wooden bar, while others gathered around tables, nursing mugs of bitter coffee or something stronger. The air hung heavy with tobacco smoke and anticipation as townsfolk huddled together, their voices a steady murmur, punctuated by occasional bursts of laughter. Rob Johnson, a stocky man with a perpetual 5 o'clock shadow and eyes that miss nothing, stood at the center of the largest group. As the town's self-appointed herald of news, he relished his position, savoring the moment before delivering his latest discovery. He raised his glass dramatically, waiting until every eye turned his way. "You won't believe it. Old mountain man John Smith is marrying Maria Garcia," he announced. His voice carried to every corner of the establishment. The silence that followed lasted only a heartbeat before the room erupted. Samuel Davis nearly dropped the glass he was polishing behind the bar, his weathered face creasing with disbelief. At a corner table, Tom Brown slapped his knee so hard it rattled the spoons in the sugar bowl. "The hermit and the seamstress? Now that's a pair I never imagined," someone called out from the back. The laughter that followed filled the room, bouncing off the walls like wild horses. Men who normally had little to say suddenly became animated storytellers, each offering their own colorful commentary on the unlikely match. "Reckon he's never seen a mirror up in those mountains," Frank Thompson quipped, earning appreciative chuckles from his companions. The bartender shook his gray head slowly. Known John Smith for 15 years, never thought he'd come down from that mountain for anything more than supplies and whiskey. As the men continued their banter, none bothered to mention John's legendary survival skills, or how he'd once tracked a lost child through a blizzard. Nor did they recall how Maria Garcia had stayed up 3 nights straight, sewing burial clothes when typhoid took the Miller family. Such kindnesses were easily forgotten in the face of such delicious gossip. Rob Johnson raised his glass again, basking in the attention his news had generated. "To the mountain man and his bride," he toasted mockingly. "May they find happiness, or at least tolerate the sight of each other." Tom Brown nearly spit out his drink, choking on the amber liquid as the news hit his ears. His weathered face contorted with disbelief, eyes widening beneath his dusty hat. "Maria Garcia? She's the spinster who's never seen a day's luck, plain as prairie mud," Tom exclaimed, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. "That woman's been sitting behind that sewing machine so long, she's practically part of it." Rob Johnson nodded, his grin spreading wide across his face like a cat that caught a particularly juicy mouse. The gossip leaned forward, lowering his voice, just enough to make everyone lean in closer. "Saw him myself at her dress shop yesterday," Rob confirmed, tapping his finger against the wooden table for emphasis. "John Smith, wild as the mountains he comes from, standing there awkward as can be, came out with a yes." He slapped his knee, delighted to be the bearer of such sensational news. The saloon crowd's disbelief manifested in a growing chorus of laughter and exclamations. Men who'd barely acknowledged each other's presence now huddled together, united by the shared entertainment of someone else's peculiar fortune. The news acted like a magnet, drawing more curious faces into their circle from the far corners of the establishment. "Maybe he lost a bet," suggested a miner, his face still streaked with dirt from his day's labor. "Or he's gone blind up in those hills," another added, triggering a fresh wave of laughter that rippled through the growing audience. Even behind the bar, old Samuel Davis shook his head while polishing a glass that had seen better days. The bartender's gray eyebrows furrowed as he surveyed the ruckus his establishment had become. "Guess even a wild man gets desperate after enough winters alone," he muttered, just loud enough for those nearest to hear. The comment earned appreciative chuckles from his regular patrons who valued Samuel's rare contributions to town gossip. The laughter gradually transformed, growing meaner with each passing minute and each emptied glass. The air in the saloon grew thick with judgment and mockery, the smell of whiskey mingling with the stench of cruelty as the men painted an increasingly unflattering picture of John and Maria's unlikely match. "Wonder what he sees in her," pondered Tom, now fully recovered from his initial shock. "Nothing much to see," Rob quipped back, triggering the loudest round of laughter yet. In the corner, a cowboy mimicked John's distinctive mountain man walk, while another pretended to be Maria, batting his eyelashes exaggeratedly. Their crude pantomime drew hoots and hollers from the increasingly rowdy crowd. The afternoon's entertainment now fully centered on two people who weren't present to defend themselves. Outside, the news of John Smith's engagement to Maria Garcia raced along the wooden sidewalks of Pine Valley like wildfire through dry brush. The morning bustle paused as whispers traveled from one ear to another, each retelling more exaggerated than the last. By midday, the gossip had reached the general store, where Mrs. Elizabeth White had strategically positioned herself near the ribbon display. "Ladies, have you heard?" Mrs. White gathered a cluster of women around her, her voice dropping to a theatrical whisper that somehow carried through the entire store. "Our mountain man is taking a wife." The women leaned in closer, packages and shopping lists momentarily forgotten. Mrs. White's eyes gleamed with barely contained excitement, though her voice remained syrupy with false concern. "Poor Maria," she sighed, adjusting her bonnet with manicured fingers. 32 years old and settling for the first man who'll have her. I always said she'd end up alone with her sewing needles, but I suppose even John Smith is better than nothing." Mrs. Peterson, whose husband led the town's small church, clutched her reticule tighter. "He probably threatened her," she declared with absolute certainty. "Those mountain men are more beast than human. Living out there with the animals changes a person." Her lips pursed in disapproval beneath her carefully arranged curls. "Perhaps she's with child," whispered Nancy Thompson, the blacksmith's wife, causing several gasps among the gathered women. "Nancy!" Mrs. White scolded, though her expression revealed she'd already considered the possibility, though it would explain such a hasty arrangement. The women giggled, their voices sharp as needles, passing judgment with every word. Not one mentioned how Maria had stayed up 3 nights straight sewing little Amy Chen's dress when the laundress's daughter needed something special for the Founders' Day celebration. None recalled how she'd reduced prices for widows, or delivered medicine during last winter's fever outbreak when the doctor couldn't make his rounds. "I heard he barely speaks 10 words together," offered Margaret Wilson from the post office. "What kind of conversation will poor Maria have up in those mountains?" "Conversation isn't likely what he's after," Mrs. Peterson replied, with a knowing look that sent another wave of tittering through the group. As they dispersed, each woman eager to spread the news further, they passed Maria's dress shop without a glance. Inside, unbeknownst to them, Maria was carefully measuring fabric for a wedding dress unlike any Pine Valley had seen before. One that would soon silence their cruel laughter and change everything they thought they knew about the quiet seamstress and her mountain man. Frank Thompson sat in the barber's chair, his face half covered in shaving cream as Pete Johnson carefully worked the straight razor along his jawline. The news about John Smith and Maria Garcia had reached the barber shop like wildfire, and Frank couldn't contain himself any longer. "Hold still now," Pete warned, pulling the razor away just as Frank began to chuckle. "I've seen prettier faces on wanted posters," Frank declared, his eyes twinkling with mischief. The four other men waiting their turn roared with laughter, slapping their knees and nudging each other. Pete, a man who prided himself on knowing every face in Pine Valley, stepped back and wiped the razor on his apron. "Maybe John's eyes have gone bad from all that mountain glare," he suggested, grinning widely. "Spend enough time squinting at the sun, and even a mule starts looking like a thoroughbred." The laughter grew louder as Sheriff Dan Martin passed by the window, shaking his head slightly at the commotion inside. The lawman had always respected John Smith, especially after the mountain man had tracked down those cattle rustlers last winter when nobody else could. "You know," said Harold Wilson, the banker's son, leaning forward in his chair, "my pa offered her a job as a housekeeper once. Said she was too proud, wanted to keep that failing dress shop instead." He adjusted his vest importantly. "Guess being a mountain man's wife beats starving alone." The men nodded sagely, as if they'd collectively solved the mystery of this unlikely union. Outside, the spring sunshine bathed Pine Valley's main street in golden light, the distant mountains standing sentinel over the frontier town. Near the schoolhouse across the way, a group of children had formed the circle, holding hands and spinning around. Their high voices carried through the barber shop's open door as they chanted, "Mountain Man and Maria, ugly as can be, Kissing." Miss Sarah Martin, the young schoolteacher who had arrived from Boston just 6 months prior, emerged from the white clapboard building. Her face flushed with embarrassment as she heard the children's cruel rhyme. "Children! That's quite enough," she called, clapping her hands sharply. "Inside for arithmetic, immediately!" The children scattered, giggling as they raced into the schoolhouse. Sarah lingered a moment on the steps, her eyes drifting toward the mountains where John Smith made his home. Though she'd never admitted aloud, she'd always found something compelling about the rugged mountain man during his rare visits to town. His proposal to Maria had sparked an unexpected curiosity in her. What had he seen in the quiet seamstress that the rest of Pine Valley had missed? With a small sigh, Sarah turned and followed her students inside, wondering what secrets lay behind this strange engagement that had set every tongue in Pine Valley wagging. By noon, the whole town of Pine Valley was a chorus of speculation and cruel amusement. The news of John Smith's engagement to Maria Garcia had spread faster than wildfire in July, each retelling more embellished than the last. The wooden benches outside the general store became an impromptu gathering spot where townsfolk shared their theories with increasing creativity. "Must have been drunk on moonshine when he proposed," declared Rob Johnson, slapping his knee. "No man in his right mind would choose her otherwise." Several nodded in agreement, while Tom Brown leaned forward conspiratorially. "My wife swears Maria's been collecting strange plants from the hills. Probably brewed some kind of love potion." This suggestion sparked a round of nervous laughter, frontier superstition mixing easily with malice. At the post office, Edgar Wilson sorted mail with deliberate slowness, ensuring each customer received not just their letters, but also his opinion on the matter. "A man living alone in those mountains needs someone to cook and clean," he pronounced with authority. "But why pick Maria when there are plenty of prettier gals desperate for husbands? Something ain't right about it." Mrs. Elizabeth White fanned herself dramatically. "Perhaps he's never seen a mirror and doesn't know what beauty looks like," she suggested, her sweet tone barely masking the poison in her words. The women around her tittered appreciatively. Outside the saloon, Samuel Davis wiped down tables while listening to Frank Thompson speculate that John must have lost a bet or suffered a head injury during his last hunting trip. "Only explanation that makes sense," the barber insisted, gesturing with his cigar. Across the dusty street, Mrs. Chen worked silently at her laundry, her hands moving steadily through the soapy water. Unlike the others, she remembered how Maria had nursed her son through fever last winter, refusing payment and bringing food when they had none. She recalled the seamstress working through the night to finish wedding clothes for the Carter family when their daughter married suddenly. The laundress kept these thoughts to herself, knowing her accented English would be dismissed anyway. Judge Peterson passed by, overhearing the gossip. "I'll be performing the ceremony next week," he announced importantly. "Should be quite the spectacle." "We'll all be there," Rob Johnson called back. "Wouldn't miss it for all the gold in California." As afternoon shadows lengthened across Pine Valley, the stories grew taller, the mockery sharper. Few considered the real people at the center of their entertainment. A lonely mountain man and a kind-hearted seamstress who had found something in each other that the townsfolk, for all their talk, couldn't recognize or understand. The late afternoon sun slanted through the blacksmith's open doors, casting long shadows across the dirt floor. Inside, the heat from the forge made the air shimmer as 22-year-old Billy Thompson, the apprentice blacksmith, hammered a glowing horseshoe into shape. His face glistened with sweat as he paused to wipe his brow with a soot-stained rag. "You fellas hear about John Smith taking Maria Garcia as his wife?" Billy called out to the small gathering of men who'd come to collect their work or simply escape their daily chores. The horseshoe hissed as he plunged it into a water barrel, sending up a cloud of steam that momentarily obscured his grinning face. When the vapor cleared, he added with a snicker, "Maybe she looks better in the dark." The men erupted in laughter. Joe Martin from the livery stable leaned against the doorframe, his weathered hat pushed back on his head. The stableman was known for his quick wit and quicker tongue, traits that had earned him both friends and enemies throughout Pine Valley. "Guess John figures any wife is better than none up in those hills," Joe remarked, chewing thoughtfully on a piece of straw. "Man gets lonely enough. Even Maria starts looking like a prize." Old Mr. Ferguson, waiting for his plow blade to be repaired, shook his head. "That mountain man's been living wild too long. Probably can't tell the difference between a woman and a bear anymore." "Except the bear might be prettier," Billy added, returning to his anvil with renewed vigor, each strike punctuating their cruel laughter. As the afternoon wore on, customers came and went from the blacksmith's shop, each one leaving with not only their mended tools or horseshoes, but also fresh ammunition for the town's favorite topic. The story grew more elaborate with each telling, embellished with details about Maria's plainness and John's desperation. Outside, Pine Valley transformed in the fading light. The setting sun painted the wooden buildings in warm gold, softening their rough edges and casting long shadows down the main street. Women hurried to finish their shopping at the general store, while men drifted toward the saloon, eager to continue the conversation over whiskey and cards. The town hummed with anticipation. What had begun as simple gossip had evolved into the main entertainment, a spectacle everyone was invested in. The upcoming wedding had become a communal obsession, fuel for whispers and laughter that would surely last long after the vows were spoken. No one seemed to notice or care that the subjects of their mockery were real people with real feelings. In Pine Valley, the story of John Smith and Maria Garcia had become something larger than life, a tale to be savored and shared like the finest brandy. The hotel dining room glowed with the warm light of oil lamps, casting long shadows across the wooden floors as the evening crowd gathered for their meals. The clinking of silverware against plates provided a steady rhythm beneath the excited chatter that filled the room. Judge William Peterson sat at the largest table, his substantial frame commanding attention as he held court among the town's most prominent citizens. "I'll perform the ceremony next Sunday," Judge Peterson announced, his booming voice carrying across the room as he cut into his steak. "But mark my words, it'll be the oddest wedding we've seen in Pine Valley. Beauty and the Beast, but who's who?" The judge roared with laughter at his own joke, slapping the table hard enough to make the glasses jump. The dinos erupted in response, their meals now seasoned with the salt of mockery. Mrs. Elizabeth White dabbed at her mouth with a napkin, her eyes gleaming with malice despite her delicate manners. "I heard John Smith barely speaks 3 words together. What kind of husband will that make for poor Maria? A silent one, thank heavens, Frank Thompson called from across the room. Saves us all from hearing whatever nonsense mountain folk believe in. Young Amy Chen moved between the tables with practiced efficiency, her serving tray balanced carefully as she refilled water glasses and cleared empty plates. Each cruel comment about Maria Garcia made her stomach tighten. Amy remembered how the seamstress had stayed up 3 nights straight to finish her mother's burial dress last winter, asking for nothing in return. Maria mended my hunting jacket when nobody else would touch it, Sheriff Dan Martin said quietly from his corner table, his voice nearly lost in the laughter. Didn't charge me a cent. His comment fell on deaf ears as Mrs. Peterson leaned forward conspiratorially. I heard he's building her a cage up there, not a home. Wild men have wild ways, after all. Amy's hands trembled slightly as she collected dirty dishes from the judge's table, her discomfort growing with each passing moment. She caught her mother's eye across the room where Mrs. Chen stood in the kitchen doorway, her expression equally troubled but resigned. Maybe she bewitched him, Tom Brown suggested, tapping his temple knowingly. Mountain Man probably never saw a woman before, wouldn't know the difference. The laughter that followed was cruel and sharp. Amy moved away, powerless against the tide of ridicule washing through the dining room. She was just a waitress, the daughter of the laundress, with no voice that would be heard over the jeers of those who controlled the town's social order. As she retreated to the kitchen, Amy wondered what Maria and John might be feeling tonight, knowing they were the entertainment that flavored everyone's evening meal. Sheriff Dan Martin sat alone on the jailhouse porch, his weathered hands methodically shaving thin curls from a block of pine. The knife moved with practiced precision as he watched the town of Pine Valley transform under the cloak of evening. His brow furrowed deeper with each burst of laughter that erupted from the saloon across the dusty street. Sometimes folks are meaner than any outlaw I've ever locked up, he muttered to himself, blowing wood shavings from his palm. The sheriff had seen his share of cruelty in his 15 years wearing the badge, men who'd rob, cheat, and kill without remorse. But there was something particularly unsettling about the town's collective mockery of John and Maria. The lawman recalled how John Smith had once carried the Peterson boy 3 miles through waist-deep snow when the child had broken his leg hunting. The mountain man had refused payment or recognition, disappearing back into the wilderness before sunrise. And Maria, Dan had witnessed her slip medicine to families who couldn't afford it, never asking for credit or thanks. Another round of raucous laughter spilled from Samuel's establishment, carrying cruel words on the night air. The sheriff's knife paused mid-stroke as he caught fragments about the beast and his burden and wedding night horrors. He shook his head, disgusted by how quickly the townsfolk he protected had turned this union into sport. Across the street, Rob Johnson stumbled out of the saloon, arms slung around Tom Brown's shoulder. Both men, red-faced and bellowing an improvised song about the unlikely couple. Their crude lyrics carried easily in the night air, making the sheriff's jaw tighten. He considered intervening, but knew from experience that drunken mockery wasn't something he could arrest them for. As the night deepened, lanterns flickered to life along the main street. The hotel dining room emptied its patrons, who gathered in small clusters, exchanging whispers and snickers. Judge Peterson's booming voice carried from one such group, mimicking wedding vows with theatrical flair that sent his audience into fits of laughter. Young Amy Chen hurried past, head down, clearly uncomfortable with the spectacle. The sheriff nodded respectfully as she passed, one of the few who seemed troubled by the town's behavior. Inside the jailhouse, the single cell sat empty. No outlaws tonight, just the lawlessness of unchecked cruelty roaming free. Dan Martin pocketed his knife and the half-finished carving, rising with a sigh. By morning, the story of John Smith and Maria Garcia would have grown even wilder, twisted by whiskey and malice into a legend of mockery that Pine Valley would feast on for days to come. What none of them realized was how dramatically this story would eventually change, and with it, the heart of their town. No one in Pine Valley bothered to consider what kind of man John Smith truly was beneath his wild appearance and solitary nature. They saw only the bearskin coat, the untamed beard, and the calloused hands, never the heart that beat beneath. 2 winters ago, when the Carter family had been trapped in their homestead during the worst blizzard in 20 years, it was John who had trudged 12 miles through waist-deep snow to bring them supplies and medicine. He had stayed 3 days, hunting game and repairing their damaged roof before disappearing back into his mountain sanctuary without waiting for thanks. Similarly, the townsfolk conveniently forgot the burdens Maria Garcia silently carried. Her dress shop stood as a testament to her resilience, after losing both parents within 6 months of each other. While women whispered behind their hands about her plain features, they eagerly sought her skilled fingers when they needed wedding gowns or baptismal clothes. Few remembered how, during the scarlet fever outbreak, Maria had worked tirelessly, using knowledge gleaned from her precious medical books to nurse the sick alongside Doc Williams. Her healing hands had saved Sheriff Martin's youngest daughter when hope seemed lost. "She's got a face that could curdle fresh milk," Rod Johnson had joked at the saloon, conveniently forgetting how Maria had sewn his wedding suit at half price when crops failed and money was tight. Samuel Davis laughed along, though Maria had once stayed up 3 nights straight to make his wife's funeral dress, refusing payment from the grieving bartender. Even Mrs. White, who led the chorus of disapproval, wore a shawl Maria had gifted her during her difficult pregnancy, the delicate embroidery representing hours of painstaking labor. The preacher's wife, Mrs. Peterson, quick to suggest John must have threatened Maria, never mentioned how the seamstress had quietly donated altar cloths to the church when the old ones had worn thin. Instead, their unlikely union became Pine Valley's favorite entertainment, a story to be twisted and embellished over whiskey at the saloon or tea in parlors. The wild mountain man and the plain spinster provided the perfect distraction from the harsh realities of frontier life. Their romance became a joke, a curiosity, an oddity to be dissected and mocked. "Better than a traveling circus," Frank Thompson declared in his barbershop, wielding his scissors with dramatic flair. "Mountain man takes pity on the ugliest gal in town. Now that's a tale worth telling." Little did they know how drastically their perceptions would change, or how deeply they would come to regret their cruel words in the days to come. John Smith stood at the edge of the valley, his weathered frame silhouetted against the crimson sunset. The dying light painted the Wyoming mountains in shades of purple and gold, a view that had been his only companion for years. At 6'4", with shoulders broad as an oak and hands that told stories of survival through their scars, he embodied the frontier legend that Pine Valley's residents both feared and mocked. The mountain man leaned against a pine tree, his calloused fingers tracing the scar that ran from his left temple to his jaw, a reminder of his encounter with a grizzly 3 winters past. His wild beard couldn't hide the other marks etched into his face by blizzards, fights, and solitary years. Most townsfolk saw only these external signs of a harsh life, never bothering to look deeper. Tonight was different. For the first time in years, John's thoughts weren't occupied by hunting routes or weather patterns. Instead, they drifted to Maria Garcia and the quiet strength he'd observed in her eyes when she'd accepted his proposal. He'd noticed her long before speaking to her, watching how she held herself with dignity despite the whispers that followed her through town, how her hands worked magic with needle and thread, how she slipped medicine to those who couldn't afford the doctor. "They don't see either of us," he murmured to the fading light, his voice rough from disuse. The town had labeled them both, him the dangerous wild man, her the plain spinster. But John had recognized something in Maria that resonated with his own spirit: resilience, intelligence, and a profound loneliness masked by purpose. He pulled a small wooden box from his pocket, opening it to reveal a simple gold band. It had belonged to his mother, the only possession he'd kept from his life before the mountains. Tomorrow it would be Maria's, if she didn't change her mind after hearing the town's cruel mockery. The thought made his jaw tighten. He'd overheard the laughter in the saloon, seen the smirks when he'd walked through town. Their ridicule meant nothing to him. He'd learned to live without approval, but he worried about Maria, who had to face their cruelty daily. As darkness settled over the valley, John straightened his tall frame and turned toward his cabin. For the first time in years, the prospect of solitude felt heavy. Soon, he hoped, his home would know a woman's presence. Not just any woman, but one who understood what it meant to stand apart, to be judged unfairly, to create worth with her own hands. Tomorrow, he would ride into town clean-shaven and dressed in his best. Tonight, under the emerging stars, John allowed himself something rare: hope. Maria Garcia sat by the open window of her small apartment above the dress shop, her fingers moving with practiced precision as she guided the needle through layers of fine cotton. The evening breeze carried the scent of pine from the distant mountains, a welcome relief from the stifling heat of the day. At 32, the seamstress had long ago accepted her place in Pine Valley, respected for her skill with fabric, but pitied for her unmarried status. The lamp beside her cast soft shadows across her workspace, illuminating the half-finished wedding dress she was creating for the banker's daughter. Maria allowed herself a small, ironic smile. How many wedding gowns had she crafted for other women, while the town whispered that she would never wear one herself? The mirror hanging on the wall opposite her reflected what Pine Valley saw: sharp cheekbones that made her face appear too angular, pale skin that refused to tan despite the Wyoming sun, and dark hair that defied every attempt to be styled fashionably. Spinster, they called her, though never to her face. The word had stung once, but years of hearing it whispered behind fans and murmured over glasses of whiskey had dulled its edge. Maria set down her sewing and stretched her tired fingers, glancing at the bookshelf where her most prized possessions rested: medical texts, journals of herbal remedies, and novels transported her beyond the confines of this frontier town. She rose and moved to the mirror, studying herself with the clinical detachment she'd developed as armor. The dress shop owner touched her reflection, tracing the features that had become a source of mockery. Yet behind those dark eyes that the townsfolk avoided lay a depth of knowledge and compassion that few bothered to discover. She had set broken bones, delivered babies, and eased fevers when the doctor was unavailable. Yet these acts remained largely unacknowledged. Her gaze drifted to the small writing desk where her journal lay open. In its pages, Maria recorded not just medical observations, but dreams and thoughts too personal to share. Last night, she had written about John Smith's unexpected proposal, the mountain man's sincere words still echoing in her mind. His eyes had held no mockery, only a recognition that had made her heart flutter with unfamiliar hope. Maria returned to her chair and picked up her needle again. The rhythmic motion of stitching calmed her racing thoughts. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to imagine a different life, one where she was valued for who she truly was, not judged for what she appeared to be. The thought was both terrifying and exhilarating, like standing at the edge of those distant mountains, preparing to step into the unknown. Maria's life had been a tapestry of quiet sorrows. When her parents, Miguel and Rosa Garcia, died within months of each other from the fever that swept through Pine Valley 5 years ago, she inherited not just the dress shop, but a profound loneliness that settled into her bones like the Wyoming winter. At 32, she'd grown accustomed to the whispers that followed her down the dirt streets. Spinster, they called her, as if her worth diminished with each passing year. The dress shop became both her sanctuary and her prison. During daylight hours, Maria's fingers worked magic with fabric and thread, creating wedding gowns for women who pitied her, Sunday dresses for girls who mocked her behind her back, and suits for men who barely acknowledged her existence. Her skill with a needle was renowned, even among those who dismissed her otherwise. But few in Pine Valley knew of her other talents. When Mrs. Chen's youngest developed a dangerous cough last winter, it was Maria who prepared the herbal remedy that cleared his lungs. When old Mr. Williams couldn't afford medicine for his rheumatism, mysterious packages appeared on his doorstep. These acts of healing and compassion remained her secrets, performed in shadows and never acknowledged. At night, after the shop closed, Maria would light her lantern and lose herself in the medical books she ordered from back east. She documented remedies in leather-bound journals, filling pages with observations and dreams that no one would ever read. Sometimes she sketched designs for dresses no one in Pine Valley would dare to wear. Bold, elegant creations that reflected the woman she knew herself to be beneath the plain exterior others saw. Then John Smith appeared at her door one Tuesday afternoon. The mountain man's massive frame filled the doorway, his scarred hands clutching his hat awkwardly. Customers scattered like startled birds at the sight of him. Maria stood her ground, measuring tape still draped around her neck. "Miss Garcia," he said, his voice surprisingly gentle for such a rugged man. "I've come with a proposition." The proposal that followed was unlike anything she could have imagined, not flowery or romantic, but honest and direct, qualities Maria had learned to value above all else. As John spoke of partnership and respect, something long dormant stirred within her chest. That night, alone with her thoughts, Maria stared at her reflection in the small mirror above her wash basin. Fear and longing battled within her heart. To accept meant leaving behind everything familiar, this shop, this town, the predictable loneliness she had learned to navigate. To refuse meant condemning herself to more of the same. Her hand trembled as she touched the glass, wondering if she possessed the courage to choose a different path. John Smith stood awkwardly in Maria Garcia's small dress shop, his large frame seeming out of place among the delicate fabrics and half-finished garments. His proposal came without flowery words or grand gestures, just honest intention wrapped in a voice unused to speaking tender thoughts. "I can't offer you riches," he said, his calloused hands fidgeting with the brim of his hat. "My cabin's simple, and the mountain life is hard. But I can offer respect, a home, and someone who sees who you really are." Maria's needle paused mid-stitch, her fingers trembling as she processed his words. The late afternoon sun streamed through the shop windows, illuminating the dust motes dancing between them. In that moment, the seamstress felt both terrified and strangely hopeful. "Why me?" she finally asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "There are younger women, prettier women." John's eyes, weathered by years facing mountain storms, met hers without flinching. "I see your strength when you stand alone against this town's cruelty. I notice your kindness when you reduce prices for the Carter family after they lost their farm. I want a partner who knows what it's like to be on the outside, someone who understands survival isn't just about staying alive, but keeping your dignity intact." His words struck something deep within her, something no one in Pine Valley had ever touched. Maria asked for time to consider, and the mountain man nodded, understanding the weight of what he'd proposed. For 3 days, Maria barely slept. She paced the wooden floors above her shop, weighing her options against the reality of her life. She thought of the whispers that followed her through town, the pitying glances from Mrs. White and her circle, the children who sometimes mimicked her walk. She recalled the lonely dinners, the empty chair across from hers, the books that had become her only companions. On the third night, she pulled out her journal and listed every time the townsfolk had tried to make her small. Every slight, every mockery, Every door closed in her face. Then she wrote what she knew of John Smith, his reputation for fairness, the stories of him helping stranded travelers, his quiet dignity despite being an outsider. When morning came, Maria walked to the edge of town where John waited as promised. The words caught in her throat, but she forced them out, surprising herself with the steady courage in her voice. "Yes," she whispered, then stronger. "Yes, I will marry you." In that moment, standing on the dusty road, with the Wyoming wilderness stretching beyond them, Maria felt something unfamiliar bloom in her chest, not just hope, but the first fragile tendrils of freedom. The town's reaction to the engagement spread like wildfire through Pine Valley. Everywhere John Smith and Maria Garcia went, whispers followed. Some folks pointed openly, while others averted their eyes as if witnessing something shameful. Yet through it all, John stood tall beside Maria, his weathered face set with determination. "Let them laugh," he told her one evening as they walked past the saloon where Rob Johnson and his cronies made no effort to hide their mockery. "Their opinion matters less than a coyote's howl." His large hand enveloped hers, and Maria felt something unfamiliar bloom within her chest. Courage. The following day, Maria was arranging fabric in her shop when Mrs. Elizabeth White swept in with 3 other women, their faces arranged in expressions of false concern. "Maria, dear," Elizabeth began, her voice dripping with sweetness that never reached her eyes. "We've come as friends to make sure you understand what you're doing. A mountain man? He'll drag you up to that wilderness and you'll never be seen again." Mrs. Peterson nodded vigorously. "My husband says those mountain types are barely civilized. Have you truly considered your safety?" Maria's hand stilled on the bolt of calico. For years, she had endured their thinly veiled insults, their patronizing tones, their orders for dresses they complained about, yet wore proudly. She thought of John's unwavering respect, how he looked at her as if she were precious rather than plain. "I've considered everything," Maria replied, her voice stronger than they'd ever heard it, "including how you come to me when your daughter needs her wedding dress rushed, or when you need herbs for your fever." She stepped around the counter, standing straight. "You call yourselves kind, but only when you need me. I'm done living by your measure." Elizabeth's mouth fell open. "Well, I never—" "No, you never have," Maria continued. "You've never seen me. John does." The women exchanged glances, suddenly unsure of their footing. This wasn't the quiet, accommodating Maria they thought they knew. "We only want what's best," one began. "What's best is for me to choose my own happiness," Maria interrupted. "And I have." The bell above the door jingled as the women left, their power over her broken. Through the window, Maria watched them hurry down the wooden sidewalk, already huddling to discuss this unexpected development. For the first time in her life, Maria Garcia felt truly free. The days before the wedding felt like walking through a gauntlet for Maria Garcia. Each morning, she'd open her dress shop to find another concerned visitor waiting. Mrs. Elizabeth White arrived with a basket of muffins and thinly veiled warnings. "My dear," she said, placing her hand on Maria's arm, "have you truly considered what life with that mountain man will be like? Winter storms that last for weeks, wild animals at your doorstep, no proper society?" Her eyes, sharp with judgment beneath her concerned expression, searched Maria's face for doubt. Maria simply continued pinning a hem. "I appreciate your concern, Mrs. White, but my mind is made up." Even Samuel Davis, who rarely left his position behind the bar, stopped by. "Miss Garcia," he began awkwardly, "that cabin's no place for a woman. John Smith has lived alone too long to change his ways now." The seamstress straightened her back. "Perhaps it's precisely because he's been alone that he values companionship more than most." The most surprising visitors were men who had never shown interest before. Frank Thompson, who had once laughed at her in his barber shop, now stood in her store with hat in hand. "I always admired your skill with a needle," he said, eyes fixed on the floor. Maybe I was hasty in not seeing your other qualities. A woman needs security that only town life can provide. Maria saw through his sudden attention. The barber wasn't offering love, only the chance to avoid becoming the subject of town gossip himself. She declined with quiet dignity, watching his face fall as he realized his opportunity for mockery had vanished. Judge Peterson's wife cornered her after church. The mountains change men, Maria. They become wild, unpredictable. Is that truly the life you want? Each warning only crystallized what Maria had begun to understand. Pine Valley had never truly seen her. They viewed her as fragile, incapable, defined solely by her plain features and unmarried status. Only John Smith had looked at her and seen strength. He valued her knowledge of healing herbs, admired her independence, and spoke to her as an equal. When he described their future together, it wasn't as master and servant, but as partners facing the wilderness side by side. On the night before her wedding, Maria stood before her small mirror. For the first time, she didn't focus on the features the town had deemed lacking. Instead, she saw determination in her eyes and purpose in her expression. Tomorrow she would marry a man who offered something no one in Pine Valley ever had, the chance to be truly seen. The morning of the wedding dawned clear and bright, as if the Wyoming Territory itself had decided to bless the occasion that Pine Valley had spent weeks mocking. In her small room above the dress shop, Maria Garcia stood before the mirror, hardly recognizing the woman who stared back. She had chosen not white, as tradition dictated, but a deep blue dress the color of twilight mountains, sewn by her own skilled hands through countless evenings of preparation. The fabric draped elegantly across her frame, accentuating strengths she'd always hidden beneath practical work clothes. At her throat gleamed her mother's silver brooch, the one treasure she'd kept from her past, now her connection to a future she'd never imagined possible. Her fingers trembled slightly as she secured it in place. "Ready?" Mrs. Chen asked softly from the doorway, the only person who'd offered to help her prepare. The walk to the church felt endless. Each step along the wooden sidewalk brought more stares, more whispers behind hands. Outside the general store, Elizabeth White and her circle fell silent mid-conversation, their eyes widening at the transformation before them. "Is that really Maria?" someone whispered too loudly. The seamstress held her head high, her spine straight as a pine tree. The mockery that had followed her announcement now shifted to something else. Confusion, reassessment, perhaps even a touch of shame. She clutched her small bouquet of wildflowers, gathered at dawn from the meadow where John had first spoken to her of partnership and respect. Inside the small church, sunlight streamed through simple windows, illuminating dust motes that danced like tiny stars. The gathered townsfolk turned as one when she entered, their collective intake of breath audible in the sudden silence. But Maria barely noticed them, her eyes fixed on John Smith, standing tall at the altar. The mountain man had transformed himself, his wild beard trimmed, his hair combed back, his massive frame clothed in a new suit that somehow made him look both civilized and even more powerful. His eyes, usually sharp as a hawk's, softened when they met hers. Judge Peterson stood beside John, his usual boisterous confidence momentarily shaken by the palpable shift in the room's atmosphere. The townsfolk who had gathered for entertainment, expecting perhaps a spectacle to mock for years to come, instead found themselves witnessing something unexpected. As Maria walked slowly toward her future husband, Sheriff Dan Martin nodded slightly from his position near the back wall, a quiet acknowledgement of her courage. Young Amy Chen smiled openly, perhaps the only genuine well-wisher in the crowd. The town of Pine Valley fell completely silent, collectively holding its breath as the unlikely couple prepared to join their lives together, forcing everyone to reconsider what they thought they knew about beauty, worth, and the human heart. The church fell silent as Judge Peterson took his place at the altar, his usual boisterous demeanor subdued by the gravity of the occasion. The wooden pews creaked under the weight of curious onlookers, their whispers dying as Maria Garcia entered in her deep blue dress, the sunlight through stained glass catching on her mother's brooch. The crowd's collective intake of breath was audible, not from mockery this time, but from genuine surprise at the quiet dignity she carried. John Smith stood tall at the altar, his imposing frame softened by the new suit that replaced his usual rugged attire. His scarred hands, steady now, reached for Maria's as she approached. The mountain man's eyes never left his bride, as if the packed church and its judgmental occupants had simply vanished. "We gather today," began Judge Peterson, his voice carrying to the rafters, "to join these two in matrimony." A cough from the back, a stifled laugh. The crowd still waited for something to mock, some confirmation of their cruel predictions. When the time came for vows, John's deep voice filled the space with unexpected eloquence. "I promise to respect you, protect you, and value you for who you are," he said, each word deliberate and sincere. "Not just today, but every day that follows." Maria's response came without hesitation, her voice clear and unwavering. "I promise to be your partner, to stand with you against all storms," she pledged, the strength in her words surprising those who had only ever seen her as meek. "To build a life where we both are seen for who we truly are." Sheriff Dan Martin, observing from the back, noted the shifting expressions around him, surprise replacing mockery, respect beginning to displace judgment. When John leaned forward to seal their union with a kiss, he did so with gentle reverence. His calloused hand cupped Maria's cheek with such tenderness that several women in the congregation found themselves unexpectedly moved. The kiss was brief but profound, not a spectacle for the crowd, but a private promise between equals. In the silence that followed, Mrs. Chen was the first to applaud, her weathered hands coming together in quiet approval. Amy Chen joined next, then Sheriff Martin. One by one, those who had benefited from Maria's quiet kindness over the years, a child whose fever she'd broken, a widow whose dress she'd mended without charge, added their hands to the growing applause. The sound swelled, hesitant at first, then gaining confidence until it filled the church with unexpected warmth. It was the first crack in the town's unified mockery. The first acknowledgement that perhaps, in their rush to judge, they had missed something essential about both the mountain man and his bride. The townsfolk's whispers faded behind them as John Smith and Maria Garcia departed Pine Valley in a horse-drawn wagon. The mountain trail stretched before them, winding through pine forests and rocky outcroppings. Maria's hands clutched her small traveling case, her wedding dress carefully folded inside. Neither spoke much during the journey, both lost in thoughts of what lay ahead. "Almost there," John said as they rounded a bend, his voice gentle. The tall mountain man pointed toward a clearing where a cabin stood against the backdrop of towering pines. Maria felt her breath catch, not from disappointment, but surprise. The cabin was nothing like the crude shelter she had imagined. Sturdy logs formed walls that gleamed with care. A stone chimney rose from the center, and a covered porch wrapped around the front. Wildflowers grew in carefully tended patches near the doorway. "You built this?" Maria asked, her sharp cheekbones flushed with the mountain air. "Every log," he nodded, pride evident in his scarred face. "Been working on it for years." Inside, Maria discovered a home, not merely a shelter. Bookshelves lined one wall, filled with volumes on medicine, history, and poetry. A large fireplace dominated the main room, with comfortable chairs positioned nearby. The seamstress ran her fingers over handcrafted furniture, recognizing the care in each piece. "The bedroom is through there," John said, indicating a doorway covered by a woven curtain. "I'll sleep out here tonight." Maria turned to him, confusion evident in her expression. "I know what they say in town." he explained, his voice low. That I wanted a wife for certain reasons, but that's not why I asked you to marry me. He moved to the fireplace, striking a match to kindle the waiting logs. I wanted a partner, someone to share this life with. The fire caught, casting warm light across the cabin's interior. Maria noticed a desk in the corner, with papers and drawings, plans for expanding the cabin, sketches of the surrounding landscape. I have something for you, John said, retrieving a package wrapped in brown paper. Inside was a journal bound in soft leather. For your medical notes, I've seen how you help people in town, even when they don't deserve it. Maria's fingers traced the cover, emotion tightening her throat. In Pine Valley, her knowledge had been dismissed, her passion for healing ignored. As night fell across the mountains, they shared a simple meal. The newlyweds spoke of practical matters, water sources, winter preparations, the garden John had started. When Maria finally retired to the bedroom, she found a quilt of vibrant colors spread across the bed. We have time, John called softly from the other room. We'll learn together. Maria lay awake, listening to the mountain sounds, realizing that in this place she might finally become the person she was meant to be. The first winter in the mountains tested John and Maria's bond in ways neither had anticipated. 3 months after their wedding, the skies darkened prematurely one December afternoon. John Smith had gone hunting that morning, promising to return before the heavy snow. When night fell with no sign of him, Maria's heart raced with dread. The blizzard that had been threatening all day unleashed its fury, blanketing the world in white. Most wives would have waited, praying for their husband's return. Maria was not most wives. She bundled herself in layers, packed John's spare coat, medical supplies, and a lantern. Tying a rope around her waist and securing it to the cabin door, she ventured into the howling storm. The wind cut through her clothes like knives, but determination drove her forward. 2 hours into her search, Maria spotted a dark shape against the snow. John lay half buried in a drift, his leg twisted beneath him. He had fallen into a ravine while tracking a deer, the injury preventing his return. Maria? He whispered through blue lips, disbelieving. You shouldn't be out here. And leave you to freeze? She replied, already wrapping his injured leg with practiced hands. Her knowledge from those medical books she'd studied in secret now saved his life. She fashioned a splint from branches, gave him water mixed with herbs to fight the fever, and somehow managed to drag her husband, a man twice her size, back to their cabin through the relentless storm. For 3 days, she nursed him, setting his broken leg properly and fighting the infection that threatened to take him. When John finally opened his eyes, truly conscious, he found his wife asleep beside him, exhausted but vigilant. Spring brought a different danger. 3 outlaws, believing the mountain cabin an easy target with John still recovering, broke in one dawn while he slept. They found Maria instead, calmly pointing a rifle at them. I've got 6 bullets, she stated, her voice steady. There are 3 of you. Even if I miss half my shots, you won't all walk out of here. Something in her eyes, a quiet, certain strength, made them hesitate. When one lunged anyway, she fired, grazing his shoulder with precision that spoke of practice, not luck. The men fled, leaving behind their weapons and wounded pride. A week later, Sheriff Dan Martin rode up to their cabin. Those men you scared off, he said, removing his hat, were wanted in 3 territories. Word spread quickly through Pine Valley. The woman they had mocked as a spinster, too plain and weak to attract a proper husband, had saved her mountain man and faced down killers. The town's perception shifted like the mountain shadows at sunset, subtle at first, then unmistakable. As the seasons turned, Maria Garcia Smith blossomed like the wildflowers that dotted their mountain home. Her hands, once known only for stitching dresses, now confidently set broken bones, tended gardens, and built furniture alongside John. The cabin transformed under their care. shelves lined with her medical journals and herbs hanging from rafters, a perfect blend of their separate lives, now intertwined. When autumn painted the mountains gold, John suggested they attend a Founders' Day celebration in Pine Valley. Maria hesitated, memories of mockery still raw, but agreed with newfound courage. They rode into town on their wagon, Maria wearing a deep burgundy dress of her own creation, her mother's brooch gleaming at her throat. The townsfolk fell silent as the couple made their way through the square. Gone was the hunched, timid seamstress they had ridiculed. In her place stood a woman who carried herself with a quiet dignity, her pale skin now kissed by mountain sun, her eyes reflecting confidence born of survival and love. "Is that truly Maria?" Mrs. White whispered to her circle, their former target now unrecognizable in her self-assurance. Sheriff Dan Martin tipped his hat respectfully. "Heard she saved 3 trappers caught in last winter's blizzard," he commented to Judge Peterson. "Used her medical knowledge when no doctor could reach them?" Even Rob Johnson, once the loudest mocker, found himself speechless when Maria calmly discussed business with the general store owner, negotiating fair prices for her handcrafted remedies that had gained reputation throughout the territory. That evening at the dance, John took his wife's hand with undisguised admiration. The mountain man moved with surprising grace, his eyes never leaving Maria's face. The townsfolk watched, transfixed by the genuine partnership evident in every shared glance and whispered word between them. "They say she faced down the Blackwater gang alone when they tried to raid their cabin," Frank Thompson told his customers days later. "John was hunting, and she outsmarted 4 armed men with nothing but wit and a rifle." As years passed, the tale of the mountain man and his once-mocked wife became Pine Valley's favorite story, not of ridicule, but of transformation. Young girls listened wide-eyed to accounts of Maria's courage. Young men studied John's unwavering respect for his wife. When Mrs. Chen's daughter married, she requested Maria's blessing, whispering, "I want a partnership like yours." Pine Valley learned its lesson through Maria and John, that true beauty emerges when someone sees your worth and stands beside you while you discover it yourself. Their love story, born of mockery but forged in respect, became the standard against which all relationships in the valley were measured for generations to come.